The Atheist HOA mocked the cross, not knowing Big Shaq wasn't wearing it for style. He wore it for battles they'd never survive. In a place where image ruled, they insulted faith without knowing who they were testing. They didn't just cross a line, they crossed Big Shaq, and Oak Meadow Glen would never be the same. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the heart of an affluent tree-lined suburb named Oak Meadow Glen, where luxury SUVs outnumber bicycles and porch lights stay on past midnight, more out of tradition than need, lived a man whose name needed no introduction outside its gates. But inside them, he was just Shaquille, or to some, simply the big man down the street. His home was the largest on the block, an ivy-draped two-story estate with slate shingles, tall hedges, and an oversized basketball hoop that most children only dared to glance at from the sidewalk. But Shaquille O'Neal was not known here for slam dunks or championships. Here he was known for silence. He moved differently than the others. He didn't wave first, but he always waved back. He didn't show up to neighborhood barbecues, but he once paid for a struggling family's entire grocery order at the local market, then walked out before they could say thank you. He didn't decorate his front yard with gaudy holiday lights, but his porch lantern never went out, always glowing like a soft promise to anyone watching from across the street. The HOA, a polished group that took pride in power disguised as policy, never quite knew what to do with him. He wasn't disruptive. He followed the rules, trimmed his hedges, paid his dues early, but his presence disrupted their pattern. His skin, his size, his quiet defiance of suburban performativity. He was faith where the HOA preferred neutrality, humility where they preferred gloss. There was something about Shaq's stillness that made people uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, not with arrogance, but with the certainty of someone who had seen things beyond what any of them could imagine. A man who had touched both glory and grief. He walked like someone with history stitched into his bones, and while most residents wore their wealth like a trophy, Shaq wore his like an old pair of shoes, comfortable, broken in, and never too polished. His neighbors speculated, of course, in wine-soaked conversations behind French doors and in digital threads buried inside neighborhood forums. He's too private, someone wrote once. He doesn't integrate. But no one could deny that when the Johnson's son broke his arm on the community trail, it was Shaq who lifted him with those enormous hands and carried him half a mile back to his parents' home. When the Simpson family's power went out during that winter freeze, it was Shaq who had a generator delivered the same day, anonymously, and when old Miss Langford passed away in his sleep, it was Shaq who shoveled his snow-covered driveway every day for the next 2 weeks, in silence, never ringing the bell. Yet still they wondered. Some said he thought he was better than them. Others feared that maybe, just maybe, he was too good, too generous, too different. In a place like Oak Meadow Glen, different was a quiet sin. Not because of explicit hate, but because of expectation. Everyone was expected to fit inside invisible boundaries, of behavior, of belief, of background. And while Shaq never broke the rules, he didn't play by their unwritten ones either. He wore a cross, always. It hung low on his chest, simple and gold, shining just enough to catch the sunlight during his early morning walks. That cross was not for show. It was memory. It was armor. It was a message to no one, and everyone. He carried something inside him that this neighborhood would never fully see. To the children, he was a quiet legend. Not because of basketball, most of them were too young to understand his legacy, but because of the way he looked at them. Like they mattered. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was soft and low, like thunder on the edge of a summer storm, a calm that made you want to listen. To the teenagers, he was mysterious. The man who left free books in the community box with pages folded at prayers. To the elderly, he was a helper, shoveling driveways, moving furniture, returning trash bins from the curb. And to the HOA, he was a question mark they couldn't erase. Ellington, the newly elected HOA president, had watched him for months. She moved in with an agenda, order, unity, and a subtle form of control. She called it preserving community culture. To her, Shaq was an anomaly. Not a threat exactly, but a disruption to the comfort she craved. His presence made her question her position, not because he challenged her, but because he didn't care to. He didn't attend her meetings. He never commented on neighborhood issues. He didn't respond to the small talk she offered when she passed him by. And yet he obeyed every bylaw, paid every fee. It irritated her more than open defiance would have. She couldn't get a read on him, and that bothered her in a neighborhood where knowing everyone's business was a sport. But Shaq wasn't hiding. He was just choosing not to explain himself to those who didn't deserve the explanation. He spent his mornings on the back patio, sipping coffee beside a hummingbird feeder. He read books that had no titles on the spine, and wrote in journals with no covers. He prayed silently, not for peace, he already had that, but perhaps for patience, for strength, for the world outside the gates that still bled. Lucille, his mother, called once a week. They never talked long, but it was always the same ending. Stay who you are, baby. Let God deal with the rest. And Shaq would smile, close his eyes, and hold the phone to his heart for a moment longer. After the call ended, people thought being quiet meant being weak. But Shaq had learned long ago, when the world shouted at you for who you were, sometimes the loudest response was silence. And so he waited, not for acceptance, not for apology, but for truth to reveal itself, the way it always does, eventually, like rust beneath paint, like weeds beneath stone. Because in places like Oak Meadow Glen, the storm never comes with thunder. It arrives in whispers, in glances, in rules rewritten just enough to target the ones they fear. And Big Shaq, the man behind the gate, had already weathered storms far worse than this. The real question wasn't whether this neighborhood was ready for him. It was whether they were ready for what they'd see when they finally looked past the gate. The morning sun spilled across Oak Meadow Glen with an almost theatrical ease, brushing over manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and driveways so clean they looked untouched. It was the kind of day the HOA relished. Clear skies, no wind, and the perfect excuse to host their quarterly community gathering. Folding chairs were set up in rows across the cul-de-sac. A table of fresh-baked pastries glistened under plastic wrap, and the HOA board members, dressed in pastel polos and overly bright smiles, positioned themselves like gatekeepers of peace. Shaq stepped out of his home, with deliberate quietness, wearing the same ease he carried every day. His shoulders filled the doorway, his stride slow and patient, not cautious, just grounded. He wore simple gray slacks, a soft navy sweater, and a thin gold cross that caught the morning light like a flicker of warmth. It wasn't loud or ornate. It didn't need to be. That cross wasn't an accessory. It was a legacy. The moment he walked toward the gathering, conversations didn't stop, but they stuttered. Words trailed off mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward the shining cross, resting over his chest. It wasn't the first time he wore it, but it was the first time he wore it to one of their events. He nodded respectfully at a couple of familiar faces, the mailman's wife, the young mom from across the street, but didn't break stride. He wasn't there to mingle. He was there to witness, maybe to listen. Ellington, the newly crowned president of the HOA, spotted him immediately. She'd prepared her speech all week, something about unity and civic responsibility, all wrapped up in rehearsed pleasantries. Her tailored blazer, stiff posture and artificial grin didn't betray her thoughts, but her eyes, those narrow, calculating eyes, gave them away. She didn't like surprises, and she especially didn't like the kind that came draped in faith and quiet strength. She continued with her speech at first, staying within her script. This community stands for harmony, respect, and shared values, she announced, her voice projected into the rented microphone. We take pride in our neighborhood, how it looks, how it feels, and how we come together. Shaq stood near the back, hands loosely folded, eyes steady, not challenging, not disengaged, simply present. Then it happened. The shift, the sharp turn disguised as a harmless comment. And while we welcome all residents, added with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, we do ask that we avoid turning these gatherings into platforms for personal beliefs or religious displays. We're a secular space, folks, not Sunday morning service. A few heads turned, some uncertain, others nodding out of politeness. No one laughed, but there was a faint ripple, a collective tension looking for a place to land. Nier's eyes locked onto Shaq's cross for just a second, then flitted away, feigning innocence. It was the kind of jab too polished to call out directly. A microaggression wrapped in community etiquette. But the damage was instant. Shaq didn't move. He didn't speak. His face remained unchanged. But the shift in the air was undeniable. People felt it. Not just the ones who cared, but even the ones who didn't. The silence that followed was louder than any protest could have been. moved on with her speech, but her words fell flat. Something in the tone had soured. Her authority, once crisp and rehearsed, now felt brittle. She knew it too, but she pressed on, refusing to acknowledge the crack she'd made. After the speech, the crowd dispersed toward the refreshment tables, but conversations were quiet, glances stolen. A few neighbors offered Shaq awkward smiles, sympathy masked as politeness, but no one approached him. Not yet. He didn't seem to expect it. Instead, he walked over to the table, picked up a cup of black coffee, and stood beneath a tree just far enough from the crowd to breathe. Lingered near the board members, laughing a little too loudly about something inconsequential, but her eyes kept drifting toward him. Her words had been calculated, but now that they'd landed, she seemed unsure of their weight. Maybe she didn't expect him to react. Maybe she expected him to leave. But he didn't. That was the thing about Shaq. His silence wasn't retreat. It was resistance in its most disarming form. Later that afternoon, the HOA group chat, usually reserved for parking violations and potluck sign-ups, began to stir. A message popped up from one of the longtime residents, an older woman named Darlene. I didn't appreciate that comment this morning. We've always been a diverse and respectful neighborhood. Another message followed. If Shaq wants to wear a cross, that's his right. Pretty sure freedom of religion still applies here. Didn't respond, but she read every word. By nightfall, whispers turned into full-blown discussions. Not just about the insult, but about who Shaq really was. People started talking about the time he paid for the Martinez twins' uniforms when their dad lost his job. About how he sponsored a local literacy drive at the library. About the checks he left with no name. For years, he had been doing things that most of them never noticed or chose not to. Until today. And yet, even as the conversation expanded, Shaq said nothing. He sat on his porch as dusk settled, sipping the last of his coffee, the cross still shining faintly under the porch light. Inside, he made no calls. He didn't draft any complaint letters. He didn't call the HOA. He let it breathe. But silence doesn't erase insult. It only sharpens the memory of it. 4. The day turned restless. She paced in her home office, rereading her notes, replaying the moment over and over. She didn't like the way it felt now, didn't like how the tone of her voice replayed in her mind. But pride has a way of speaking louder than conscience, and pride told her she hadn't done anything wrong. She was protecting neutrality. That was her line. That was her she. But even as she rationalized, the truth gnawed at her. She didn't insult a stranger. She insulted the man whose presence made the neighborhood feel safer. The man who built bridges with acts, not words. The man whose faith wasn't an announcement, but a lifeline. The next morning, the sky was overcast, and expected things to return to normal. But as she opened her email, a message awaited her from the HOA board vice president, a quiet man named Miles, who rarely made waves. It read, "We need to talk about yesterday. I think an apology is in order." Stared at the screen. Her cursor blinked back at her like a question mark. The unraveling had begun. Shaq didn't know about the email. He didn't know about the messages, or the debates brewing behind closed doors. He was out back, feeding the neighborhood cat that had made his yard its home. He moved the same as he did every morning. Slow, peaceful, with a calm that came from somewhere deeper than routine. But the neighborhood was no longer still. Something had cracked beneath the surface. And for the first time, it wasn't Shaq they were questioning. It was the woman who thought power meant control. The fire had been sparked, not with fury or shouting, but with a gold cross worn boldly and a silence held even bolder. What came next would shift the quiet order of Oak Meadow Glen in ways Ellington could not undo. Ellington's comment hadn't exploded like a scandal. No. It had done something subtler, more lasting. It had shifted something, not in the dramatic way she'd feared, or perhaps hoped, but in a way that made people uncomfortable in their own kitchens. Not because of what was said, but because of who it was said to, and who he quietly continued to be after it was said. The man with the cross had not reacted. He hadn't posted a word on social media. He hadn't written a complaint or organized a response. Instead, on Monday morning, he was seen walking a paper bag of groceries to 1014 Birchmont Drive, the home of Miss Langston, a war veteran with bad knees and worse memory. On Tuesday, he was spotted kneeling beside the Wilson family's front lawn, hands deep in the earth as he unclogged their sprinkler line, his shirt soaked but his face calm. By Thursday, he'd dropped off a stack of children's books at the community library box, every one of them gently used, and inside each cover, a handwritten note: "You matter more than you know. Keep reading." Shaq didn't need an audience. He didn't even need thanks. His rhythm was the same as it had always been. Quiet, intentional, kind. But now, people were noticing in ways they hadn't before. Noticing the way his presence radiated steadiness. How his silence wasn't avoidance but something stronger, something sacred. A woman named Tara, who'd lived in Oak Meadow Glen for 6 years without ever speaking more than a passing hello to Shaq, told her friend over coffee, "I think he helped my nephew last year. Paid for a specialist when no one else would. We never knew who it was. But now I wonder." The friend, a school counselor, recalled seeing Shaq at a fundraising event, but standing in the back, not on stage, just watching, just giving. At the playground near the edge of the community, a group of teenagers sat on the bleachers, talking in half-lowered voices. One of them, a lanky boy with headphones slung around his neck, said he once saw Shaq sit with a kid who'd skinned his knee during a pickup game. Didn't say much, just handed him a napkin from his car and waited till the kid stopped crying. Another chimed in, "I saw him stop traffic once so a family of ducks could cross the road. Swear to God." These weren't dramatic stories. No headlines, no camera flashes. But they grew like ivy, quiet and steady, wrapping around the neighborhood's neatly stacked assumptions. For years, Shaq had been something of a myth here. A gentle giant, a retired superstar tucked away in luxury. But now he was something else. Something harder to define. Ellington, for her part, pretended not to notice the shifting mood. But she felt it. The way some board members no longer met her eyes. The way small talk fizzled out when she walked into a room. Her authority remained intact, but it was thinner now, like old paint peeling under sunlight. She hosted a midweek Zoom call to clarify expectations for future events, using language like community neutrality and personal decorum. But the only people who stayed past the first 10 minutes were the ones who always agreed with her anyway. Meanwhile, in the heart of Oak Meadow Glen, change wasn't being voted on. It was being felt. A neighbor named Calvin, known for his pristine lawn and rigid opinions, watched from his window as Shaq helped his elderly next-door neighbor lift a broken trellis. Calvin didn't wave. He never had. But later that day, he left an envelope taped to Shaq's door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Didn't realize you were the one who paid my niece's tuition help. Thank you." No signature. Just gratitude. And the beginning of humility. A community newsletter came out that Friday. It usually featured gardening tips, recipe swaps, and HOA reminders. But this time, the final page included a short essay titled "The Quiet Ones." It didn't name names. It simply talked about people whose actions speak louder than meetings. People who carry weight without asking others to hold it for them. Ellington didn't approve that addition. Someone on the editorial team slipped it in. She found out later and was furious, but she didn't remove it. She knew better. At least now she did. Saturday brought more motion. 2 kids knocked on Shaq's door, each holding a poster they'd made from construction paper. One read, "Thanks for keeping us safe." The other, "You're a real hero." Shaq accepted the posters with a soft smile and offered them each a snack from his kitchen: grapes and graham crackers. No photos, no posts. Just a quiet exchange between a man who gave and children learning what giving looked like. By now, the whispers had evolved. They weren't just about Ellington's comment. They were about Shaq's response to it, or rather his lack of one. In Oak Meadow Glen, where every slight usually triggered a wave of HOA complaints or public drama, his restraint stood out. It made people question their own instincts, made them think about what dignity actually looked like. Was he angry? Probably, but he hadn't weaponized it. Instead, he'd continued being who he was, without shrinking, without posturing. That cross stayed visible around his neck at the dog park, at the grocery store, during his evening walks. A quiet rebellion against the idea that he should hide anything sacred, just to keep others comfortable. That alone, his refusal to disappear, was its own kind of power. On Sunday evening, a few neighbors gathered in someone's backyard for a casual dinner. As wine flowed and laughter softened, the topic returned to the cross thing. A woman named Meredith, who'd once led the PTA, said, it wasn't just about the necklace. It was the way she said it, like his faith was a nuisance. Another neighbor added, and the way he stayed, just stood there, didn't flinch, That takes more strength than yelling ever could. They nodded, not because they fully understood, but because they were beginning to realize they didn't need to. What mattered was listening. Ellington sat in her own living room that night, glass of white wine in hand, scrolling through her phone. She saw the pictures, the neighborhood kids with Shaq's posters, the subtle shift in comments under HOA posts. Less cheerleader, more critique. She felt it in her bones. She was losing control of the narrative. And the worst part, he hadn't lifted a finger to take it from her. The man with the cross had simply been, and somehow, that was louder than anything she had said. Oak Meadow Glen wasn't erupting. It was evolving. In whispers. In quiet reckonings. In changed minds. And opened eyes. And the man they once labeled as distant? He was now the one they were all watching. Not out of suspicion, but out of admiration. Out of curiosity. Out of the slow-growing hope that maybe they could learn something from the way he moved through the world. Shaq hadn't spoken a single public word about what happened that morning. And maybe he never would. Because sometimes grace doesn't need a microphone. It just needs enough room to be seen. In Ellington's world, power was about preservation, appearances, expectations, and control. She believed the HOA's strength lay in its structure, in the fine print that made civility enforceable. And when civility became inconvenient, she knew how to manipulate the lines between policy and punishment. She had inherited the rulebook, yes, but she had also learned how to weaponize it without ever raising her voice. And so, the retaliation began. Not loudly, not in the way of angry people or bruised egos, but in the calculated rhythms of bureaucracy. The first letter came in a crisp white envelope. Violation, decorative elements exceeding HOA guidelines. The complaint? A garden statue tucked behind Shaq's hydrangeas. A bronze angel with folded wings, barely visible from the sidewalk. No one had noticed it in 4 years, but now it was suddenly non-compliant with approved aesthetics. Shaq read the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer without comment. The second letter followed 3 days later. Notice court dimensions violate community recreation ordinances. This time, it was his basketball court, a custom-built half-court near the back of his property, well within his fence line, and nowhere near any neighboring homes. Ellington cited a zoning clause last amended in 2008, one that was vague enough to sound enforceable but outdated enough to be almost irrelevant. The document lacked specificity, but it was official enough to create pressure. Shaq didn't dismantle the court. He didn't write back, but he did install motion sensor lights around it, and trimmed the hedges so kids from nearby houses could still peer through and dream. The third incident wasn't a letter. It was a citation left on his mailbox for excessive lighting after hours. Ironically, it was the same porch lantern he'd always used, the one that glowed soft and golden into the night like a lighthouse for anyone passing by. The complaint stated it violated the new Dark Sky Initiative, a regulation Ellington pushed through the board just 2 weeks prior. She told the other board members it was about energy conservation, about environmental responsibility. But everyone knew it was personal. Still, no one challenged her. Miles, the vice president of the HOA, hesitated once. He mentioned to Ellington over email that Shaq had never been a problem before, that maybe the enforcement was beginning to feel targeted. Ellington replied with a polite but firm reminder that consistency in policy is essential to fair leadership. She ended the message with a smiley face, her version of a closed door. Other members stayed quiet. They saw the pattern, felt the discomfort, but said nothing. This wasn't the kind of racism you could record on a phone, or quote in a courtroom. This was the kind that lived in bylaws and neighborly suggestion boxes, the kind that dressed itself in policy and tucked itself into smiles. Meanwhile, the neighborhood watched. Some pretended not to notice. Others noticed too much. A single father named Jerome, whose house backed up to Shaq's, told his son to stay out of sight when playing basketball. Just for now, he said, though he didn't say why. A retired school teacher 2 doors down made banana bread and left it on Shaq's porch with a card that read, "Thank you for staying." She never rang the bell. Tension spread like a slow leak. Every HOA update felt heavier. Every new rule landed with suspicion. Residents began decoding emails like puzzles, reading between lines, guessing targets, predicting who'd be next. Ellington continued to act as if everything was normal. She chaired meetings with a clipboard and a fake laugh. She hosted wine and cheese mixers and posed for the neighborhood Facebook page beside banners that read Oak Meadow together. But in her eyes was the urgency of someone trying to rewrite a narrative slipping through her fingers. At her core, Ellington couldn't comprehend why her actions weren't working. The letters were legal. The citations, technically enforceable. She had anticipated resistance. But not this kind. Not this stillness. Shaq refused to escalate. He refused to leave. His composure undermined her campaign in ways outrage never could. And then came the landscaping audit. Ellington pushed for it during a closed-door HOA board session, citing aesthetic consistency across the community. It gave her an excuse to scrutinize every flower bed, every lawn edge, every tree height, and the power to issue warnings accordingly. Shaq received a notice the following week about overgrown ivy along the north fence. The ivy in question was a modest, leafy trail barely knee-high, but the citation stood. This time, Shaq did respond. He trimmed it himself, slowly, on a Sunday morning, knowing full well the show was half the message. He wore gloves, a wide hat, and headphones that piped soft gospel through the air. Neighbors saw him from their windows, moving with methodical grace, a man pruning plants and prejudice in one quiet sweep. That same evening, Ellington received a letter in her HOA inbox. It was unsigned but clear. "You're embarrassing us. This is not leadership. It's targeting. Stop." She didn't reply. But for the first time, she stayed off the community forum for 2 full days. The psychological toll deepened. She checked the HOA portal obsessively, watched for any signs of pushback. None came directly. But her isolation became visible. People stopped laughing at her jokes. Invitations trickled. Her name wasn't mentioned in passing conversations as much anymore. She could feel the walls moving, not collapsing, but adjusting to exclude her from the center she once owned. Shaq, meanwhile, kept moving. He began walking with an elderly woman who had lost her dog. He delivered a new basketball to a kid whose ball had rolled into a sewer grate. He started reading at the local library every other Thursday to a group of second graders. All under the radar, no press, no fanfare. And yet the irony remained. In trying to shrink him, Ellington had magnified him. Every attempt to shame him became a stage for his quiet resilience. Every policy turned spotlight. Every letter became a mirror, reflecting not who Shaq was, but who she had become. The paranoia grew sharper. Ellington started saving screenshots of Facebook threads. She documented her HOA decisions in folders labeled backup and legal justification. She rehearsed responses in the mirror. "It's not personal, it's policy. I'm just doing my job. There's no favoritism here." But even she didn't believe herself anymore. At the next board meeting, attendance was low. Half the seats were empty. No one brought cookies or coffee. The air was thick. Ellington opened the meeting with the usual agenda, but her voice had lost its certainty. One board member, Danielle, finally spoke up midway through. She didn't look at Ellington. She looked down at her hands. "I think we need to revisit how we're interpreting enforcement, because something doesn't feel balanced." A pause. A long one. Ellington clenched her pen tighter. "If you're implying bias, I think you're mistaken." "No one said bias," Danielle replied. "But fairness isn't always about sticking to rules. Sometimes, it's about recognizing when the rules are being bent to break people." The meeting ended early. Shaq never mentioned that meeting. He didn't need to. He simply showed up the next day, cross on his chest, sweat on his brow, helping the local church repaint its benches. The kids joined him. The elderly watched, and slowly, a new kind of order took root in Oak Meadow Glen, not from the bylaws, but from the example of a man who never once had to raise his voice to be heard. Shaq opened the door before she knocked, like he'd known the exact moment she'd step onto his property. No smile, no fanfare. Just a long look between mother and son, the kind of look that didn't need words. He stepped aside, and she walked in like she had every right to, because she did. Lucille O'Neill was not tall, but she carried herself like she was. Her frame was wrapped in grace, her eyes sharp but not harsh. She had lived through decades of too much, and still moved like a woman who'd been called many names, some respectful, some not, but had only ever answered to one: Mama. The home smelled of cedarwood and comfort. Sunlight fell across the hardwood floors in angles that felt intentional. Lucille paused by the living room window, took in the view of the neighborhood she'd heard so much about. It was clean. It was quiet. but it was also tense in the way that only pristine places can be, where silence masks judgment and lawns are trimmed to hide what hearts won't admit. She didn't mention the letters on the kitchen counter, though she clocked them instantly, the neat stack of HOA warnings, folded with precision, waiting like unanswered questions. She noticed the porchlight citation, the complaint about the angel statue, the note about the basketball court. She didn't pick them up. She didn't need to. Shaq brought her a glass of sweet tea, the way she liked it. Just enough lemon, not too much sugar. They sat on the back porch, where the breeze carried the scent of blooming lavender, and for a moment, they said nothing. It was the kind of silence that mothers and sons earn over years of speaking only when it matters. "I saw the light," she said finally, her voice smooth and deliberate. "Still shining. I'm glad." Shaq nodded, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his eyes fixed ahead. She looked out over the lawn, saw the hoop in the distance, the trimmed hedges, the kids' chalk drawings, faint on the edge of the driveway, remnants of a joy that hadn't been scrubbed away just yet. "They've been trying you," she said next. It wasn't a question. Shaq exhaled through his nose, then leaned back in his chair, the cross on his chest catching the sun. He didn't say yes. He didn't have to. Lucille shifted slightly, crossed one leg over the other, and placed her hand on the armrest. "You know, when you were little, I used to pray over your crib. Didn't have much else. No money, no help. Just faith. I asked God to make you strong, but not just in body, in spirit. Told him, if he gave you height, give you heart too. If he made you big, make you Shaq glanced at her then, the edges of his mouth lifting just a little. "You think kindness is weakness, that it makes you an easier target," she continued. "But it's not weakness. It's warfare. Most people too scared to fight with grace." She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. Each word was a brick in the foundation she'd been laying his whole life. Her presence alone restructured the room. Where others challenged Shaq's dignity, Lucille reminded him of its origin. "You could clap back," she said, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Could call folks out, make a whole mess of it, but I know you. That ain't your way." Shaq looked down at his hands, those massive hands that once broke backboards but now repaired, leaking pipes, carried groceries, held trembling shoulders without a word. "I ain't saying don't speak," she added, "but don't you let them pull you out your piece. That ain't where your power is." They sat in silence again, the hum of birdsong filling the gaps. Lucille reached into her purse and pulled out a folded cloth, unwrapped it carefully, revealing an old photo. Shaq, no older than 6, holding a wooden cross he'd made at Sunday school. His eyes were round and unsure, but his grip on that cross was steady. "You used to sleep with this under your pillow," she said, smiling. "Said it made you feel safe. I didn't have the heart to tell you it was splintering. Let you believe in its strength." Shaq chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. Lucille placed the photo beside her glass. "That necklace you wear, it's not decoration. It's declaration. You don't carry that cross. That cross carries you." She turned toward him, her gaze direct but gentle. "And don't you let nobody, no neighbor, no board, no paper-pushing figurehead, make you forget who you are or who you come from. You walk in rooms your ancestors couldn't even enter. You pray with a strength they died for. You serve with hands that were meant to build more than courts." Shaq's jaw clenched, just briefly. Not in defiance, but in the quiet ache of being seen. Truly seen. Lucille reached over and laid her hand over his. "They trying to shrink you," she whispered. "But baby, you too rooted for that." The wind picked up just a little, rustling the leaves. A few children's voices echoed faintly from a nearby yard. Lucille smiled, then stood slowly, straightening her blouse. "I'm gonna go put on some tea. You hungry?" she asked casually, as if she hadn't just dropped thunder into the conversation like it was casual weather. Shaq nodded, but stayed seated for a moment longer. Watched her walk inside, each step measured, confident, the kind of woman who didn't need to shout to fill a room. The kind who left a legacy behind her like footprints in wet cement. That evening, the porch light stayed on again. Steady, defiant, warm. The cross hung heavier around his neck, but not in burden, in purpose. Because sometimes the strongest armor isn't loud. Sometimes it wears a hat and carries sweet tea. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a mother who never needed permission to speak truth. Lucille had come not just to visit her son, but to remind the neighborhood, without saying a word, that he wasn't alone. And that faith, when worn with love and backed by legacy, is a kind of protest no policy can touch. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed neatly, handwritten in blue ink, with long, deliberate strokes. It rested at the bottom of a small stack of mail in the HOA president's box, wedged between a landscaping invoice and a catalog from a luxury garden retailer. The handwriting wasn't familiar. It was addressed to Miles Carrington, the HOA vice president, but it had been delivered to the wrong box. The moment she picked it up, she noticed the return address: W. Denning, 1114 Valley Creek. A quiet man who rarely spoke at meetings, Walter Denning was a retired Army vet, widowed, who kept to himself except to wave at passing joggers. He never caused trouble, paid his dues early, and pruned his bushes with military precision. She didn't open it at first. She told herself she wouldn't. But as she sorted through the rest of the stack and the weight of her own recent actions lingered like static, her thumb traced the edge of the envelope. The paper was thick, the kind used for formal letters, respectful, sincere. She walked into her home office, closed the door, and set the envelope on the desk. Miles would probably come by for it later. Maybe. But something about the neatness of the handwriting, the gentleness of the name on the sender line, it gnawed at her. That and her curiosity had begun to bend inward lately, curling into guilt. She knew the HOA was watching her differently now. Not openly, not enough to call it dissent, but eyes had changed, tones had shifted. The silence that once meant obedience now felt like avoidance. And Shaq, he hadn't retaliated. He hadn't said a word, but somehow that made her feel exposed in ways she couldn't explain. She stared at the letter again. Then finally, against her better judgment, she opened it. The contents were handwritten, just like the envelope. There was no fanfare, no flourishes, just raw gratitude pressed into every line. Dear Mr. Carrington, I know you're close with him, and I don't want to make a public show, so I'm trusting you with this. Please let Shaq know how deeply grateful I am. He paid my grandson's tuition, all of it, not a loan, not a scholarship, a check sent directly to the registrar's office. No return address, no request for acknowledgement, but they told me his name when I asked, quietly, in confidence. I had no idea he knew about our family's situation. I never mentioned it. I never asked him for a thing, but somehow he knew, and he stepped in without hesitation. My grandson is going to be the first in our family to graduate college. That's because of Shaq. Please tell him that I will never forget what he did. Not just the money, but the way he made us feel seen. Walter Denning. She read it again. Then a third time. Her breath caught between sentences like her body couldn't decide whether to exhale or hold on. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. It wasn't just the kindness that struck her. It was the ease with which it had been given. No credit, no announcement, no agenda. It stood in such stark contrast to the way she operated. Every act weighed, every move calculated, every gesture meant to secure a place, an image, a version of control. She folded the letter back into its envelope, but didn't seal it. Her hands moved robotically now, while her mind wandered further than she liked. For the first time in weeks, her thoughts drifted not to Shaq's cross, or the board meetings, or the mounting discomfort in the community, but to herself, to a past she'd carefully compartmentalized behind promotions, neighborhood status, and structured living. A past she'd buried beneath clipped hedges and cordial smiles. Her fingers brushed over a photo frame on her desk, an old black and white snapshot of her with her sister back before they stopped speaking. Her sister had always called her out, always challenged her, and she had hated that about her. But maybe what she hated more was that her sister had been right. There had been a time, a different life it seemed, when she knew what it felt like to be powerless, not in a dramatic movie scene way, but in the quiet, invisible way that creeps in when you know you're not welcome, even if no one says it, when you feel the stares, the dismissals, the assumptions. Back then, she swore that once she had influence, she'd never be made to feel small again. But somewhere along the way, her mission twisted. Power became performance. Safety became superiority. She hadn't wanted to oppress, but she'd certainly wanted to manage, to be the one doing the watching, instead of the one being watched. And now she was reading a letter meant for someone else, written by a man who had experienced war, who had buried a wife, who had raised a family in quiet perseverance, and even he was humbled by Shaq's generosity. It wasn't just the money, it was the unseen observation, the private response to suffering, the choice to give without expecting a thank you. She felt ashamed, Not just for reading the letter, but for not being capable of writing one like it. Her mind flicked back to the HOA meetings, the policies she'd pushed, the citations she'd issued. She remembered sitting at her desk late one evening, tweaking a new rule proposal, knowing full well that it would affect only one person on the block. She told herself it was policy, but now it sounded like excuse. The shame settled heavier now, and within it something else, fear. Because if Walter Denning knew, others might too. And if others knew about the tuition, what else might Shaq have done that no one had noticed yet? What other silent debts of gratitude lived just beneath the surface of Oak Meadow Glen? She placed the letter back into the envelope and walked outside. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows across the walkways. She stepped quietly to Miles Carrington's house, knocked once, and left the envelope in his mailbox. Back inside, she poured herself a glass of water, but didn't drink it. Her hands gripped the edges of the kitchen counter. She didn't want to cry. That would be too easy, too performative. She just wanted to stop feeling like she was the only person in the room who didn't understand what real strength looked like. She thought of Shaq, not the man at the HOA meetings, not the neighbor with the gold cross, but the one who paid tuition in silence, who trimmed ivy without bitterness, who carried grace like armor. She envied him, not for his fame, not for his wealth, but for the fact that his decency wasn't dependent on recognition. He wasn't trying to be seen, he simply was. That night, she sat at her desk for hours, staring at the screen. No emails, no notes, just reflection. She thought about calling her sister, about apologizing for the years of distance. But her hand hovered over the phone and didn't move. Small steps. In the end, she did something small, but unfamiliar. She drafted a new email to the HOA board, recommending a community scholarship program for underprivileged students, funded voluntarily, open to all residents, named anonymously. She didn't mention Shaq, but she didn't need to. The letter she'd read was never meant for her. But somehow it had reached exactly the person it needed to. It started with a digital breadcrumb, a seemingly harmless Google search on a slow afternoon. Colton Reeves, a quiet resident who kept to himself and spent more time tinkering with old radios than attending HOA functions, had decided to finally read the bylaws out of boredom. But as he scrolled through the HOA's website, something nagged at him, an inconsistency in the way certain violations had been enforced lately. He wasn't the type to stir trouble, but he was the type to question pattern. He started digging, not just into policy, but into the woman enforcing it. He wasn't looking for dirt. Exactly. More like context. A better understanding of why things felt off. Why Shaq, who by all visible standards was a model neighbor, had become the silent target of such scrutiny. Late one night, Tolton found it. Buried beneath layers of outdated corporate filings and long-forgotten local news archives. A civil suit from 12 years prior, filed in another state, settled out of court. The plaintiff had accused the firm of discriminatory hiring practices. The named supervisor in the complaint, the same woman now sitting atop Oak Meadow Glen's HOA. It wasn't just a suit, it was a statement. The documents described a pattern of behavior, not a single incident. A culture of exclusion, subtle, yes, sophisticated even, but damaging. The plaintiff, a black woman with years of industry experience, had been denied promotions, excluded from key meetings, and eventually terminated without explanation. The company claimed restructuring. Her lawyers claimed racism. The case never made headlines. It was quietly sealed and resolved. Colton stared at the screen for a long time, blinking as the weight of what he'd found settled in. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed, and suddenly hyper-aware of how this information reframed everything. The citations, the policies, the smiles, the timing. He printed the documents and slipped them into a folder. He didn't send them to the HOA mailing list. He didn't post them online. Instead, he walked to Miles Carrington's house the next morning and handed them over without a word. Miles read every page. Twice. That afternoon, the first resignation came. Catherine Bell, a long-serving member of the HOA board, known for her polite diplomacy and overly complex dessert recipes, submitted her resignation in an email so terse it almost felt cold. "I can no longer in good conscience serve under current leadership," she wrote. "This is not the community I signed up to support." No explanation. No elaboration. Just a door softly closed. Word spread like ivy after a storm. Not explosive, but uncontainable. Neighbors started whispering again. Only this time it wasn't about Shaq. It was about her. The past she'd buried had roots too deep to stay hidden forever, and in a neighborhood obsessed with image, the most dangerous thing someone could be was exposed. The next HOA meeting was sparsely attended, but the air was thick. Miles sat stiffer than usual, and for once, the note cards on the president's clipboard remained untouched. Someone asked, "Are the rumors true?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she launched into a vague monologue about growth and the learning curve of leadership, filled with euphemisms that only made things worse. Someone else said, "You can't preach fairness and hold that history in your pocket like it doesn't matter." Again, no real reply, just a tight-lipped smile and a shift in posture, as though good posture could erase bad character. Shaq wasn't at the meeting, but that made his absence louder. What began as whispers turned to reckonings. The neighborhood Facebook group, normally a flurry of garage sale flyers and lost pet alerts, lit up with threads that danced dangerously close to open revolt. Some residents defended her. People change. It was years ago. Let's not judge. But others weren't so forgiving. Change isn't real if the pattern still exists. One post read, "Power doesn't forget how to protect itself," said another. The sentiment was clear. People were tired of quiet power plays, dressed as professionalism, tired of performance masquerading as integrity, and tired of watching someone be punished for wearing a cross, while the person punishing him wore a mask. At the edge of the neighborhood, a group of teenage boys painted over the graffiti on the community park's old basketball wall, an old project Shaq had supported privately. They didn't talk about what was going on. They just worked. But the silence was full of understanding. By week's end, another anonymous letter arrived at the HOA office. It read, "You thought the past would stay buried. But roots always reach up, even under concrete. You can't lead a community while standing on a foundation that doesn't belong to you." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. Back at Shaq's home, nothing had changed on the surface. He still walked at dawn, still nodded to neighbors, still wore the cross, still helped where he could. He didn't gloat, didn't respond. He lived as though the shift around him wasn't about him at all, which only made people lean in more. One evening, Colton stopped him near the mailbox. "I found the file," he said quietly. Shaq looked at him, expression unreadable. "I didn't share it publicly," Colton added. "But the board knows. Some neighbors too." Shaq didn't speak for a moment. Then finally, "That's not mine to carry. But thank you." Colton nodded, feeling both humbled and confused. "You could have used it to push her out," he said. Shaq gave the smallest smile. "Power that needs pushing never really belonged to me anyway." The message was clear. He didn't want revenge. He wanted truth. And now that truth was out in the open, he had already moved on. While others scrambled to process the reckoning, Shaq remained steady, the moral gravity around which the entire narrative now orbited. The community had shifted again, but not back to silence. This time it was different. Residents began asking questions at meetings. They requested transparency in board votes, suggested term limits, demanded open discussions. For the first time, power had to explain itself. One night, a small group of neighbors gathered at the park. No flyers, no speeches, just conversation, real conversation, about equity, about community, about how easy it had been to assume good leadership, based on appearances and polished language, and about how easy it was to vilify quiet people who didn't play the politics of popularity. A teacher brought up a quote she'd seen on a classroom wall. "When you plant truth, justice grows, even if it grows slow." Everyone nodded. Shaq never claimed credit. He never pointed fingers. But his stillness had created a mirror, and the neighborhood was finally looking at its reflection. As for the woman in question, she didn't resign, not yet. But her power was shrinking, her allies were leaving, and the community once comfortably under her thumb had started building a spine of its own. In Oak Meadow Glen, truth didn't crash through walls. It seeped into the cracks, and what had once been buried had finally risen. Then came the moment listed last on the agenda, community forum concerns and comments. Miles cleared his throat, then leaned forward. "We'd like to open the floor for resident remarks," he said. "Please keep comments respectful and limited to 2 minutes." There was a pause, the kind that sits on the edge of something irreversible. Then, a man stood up. He was middle-aged, Latino, with sun-darkened skin and work-worn hands. His name was Arturo Morales. He adjusted his baseball cap, then spoke into the mic. I've lived here 10 years. I'm not always part of these meetings, but I've always paid attention. He looked out at the crowd. I remember when my youngest had pneumonia. We couldn't afford the hospital transport from urgent care. I didn't even know how we were gonna get him home. Next day I got a call from the clinic. They said someone had already covered the ambulance bill. Wouldn't say who. But later that week, Shaq dropped off a small toy truck for my boy, said nothing about the bill, just left it and walked off. He stepped back, nodding once, then took his seat, silent. Then a woman stood, older, white, cardigan buttoned to her throat. Her name was Lois Templeton. She looked like she'd never missed an HOA meeting in her life. But today her expression was softer, like she'd been holding something in for too long. 4 years ago, she said, my husband had a fall in our driveway. I was inside, didn't know until the doorbell rang. Shaq was standing there, holding Harold up like he weighed nothing. He didn't just help him. He stayed with us the whole night, sat in the hospital waiting room while I cried, never told anyone. She didn't cry as she spoke, but her voice broke, just once. Then she sat down, folding her hands in her lap like she'd just finished something sacred. Another stood, and another. A young couple, interracial, shared how Shaq helped install safety rails for their elderly mother when contractors flaked last minute. A teenager said Shaq showed up to his school's career day, not to talk about basketball, but to listen. He was the only one who didn't try to give advice. He just sat in the back and clapped for everyone. Every story was different, but the theme echoed. Shaq had been there, quietly, steadily, unconditionally. Not once had he asked for recognition. Not once had he used it as currency to buy goodwill. He had simply been there again and again when others looked away. And now, finally, the community had stopped looking away too. The woman at the head of the table tried to interrupt once, clearing her throat as if to bring decorum back into the room. Let's remember this is a governance review, not a testimonial gathering. But no one listened. A wave of dismissal spread across the room. Not rude, just resolute. This was no longer her meeting to control. Then Miles spoke. I believe what we're witnessing is part of governance, he said calmly. It's about accountability. Leadership isn't just about rules. It's about reflection. And right now, the community is reflecting something we can't ignore. A low murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Someone from the back called out, "Can we put a motion on the floor?" Miles looked down, considered it, then nodded. Yes, a motion to vote on the continuation of current board leadership can be placed by a 2/3 member quorum. Hands shot up. More than enough. The vote wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Residents raised hands. Ballots were counted, and the result came without fanfare. Majority in favor of removal. The placard on the table might as well have disappeared. She didn't protest. She simply sat still, jaw tight, eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. She had built her power like a castle of sand, polished on the outside, fragile underneath, and now the tide had risen, not in fury, but in unity. When the meeting adjourned, people didn't cheer. They didn't gloat. They stood, gathered their things, and filed out in silence, a quiet procession of a community reborn. Some glanced at Shaq on their way out, nodded, touched his arm, offered a smile. He acknowledged them all, the same way he always had, with presence, not posture. Miles caught up to him near the door. You could have called her out yourself, made it personal. Shaq shook his head. Didn't need to. She made it personal on her own. Miles smiled. You didn't say a word. Shaq shrugged, then looked out at the last few people leaving. Didn't have to. Outside, the sky was lavender, the first stars beginning to show. As the crowd dispersed, something lingered, a feeling not of triumph, but of truth, of a weight lifted, of people finally choosing not to be silent when it counted most. In the days that followed, the HOA announced a new interim president, a retired teacher known for her fairness and listening ear. Community forums were expanded. Transparency clauses were added to the bylaws. Things were changing, not just in name, but in spirit. And Shaq, he stayed the same. He watered his plants. He waved at neighbors. He dropped off books at the library box. But now, when he walked through Oak Meadow Glen, he no longer walked alone. The air around him had shifted, not because he sought to be followed, but because he had shown what leadership looked like when it didn't need to announce itself. It was a meeting, but more than that, it was a moment. A turning point. The one that changed everything. She hadn't been sleeping. The past few nights blurred together in restless fragments, each one bringing flashes of what she'd said, what she'd done, and more disturbingly, what she hadn't noticed herself becoming. Control had once felt like safety, structure had felt like protection, but now, stripped of position, she faced something she had spent her entire adult life avoiding herself. She leaned in closer to the mirror. The fine lines near her eyes had deepened, not from age, but from holding her face too tightly, in polite performance. The corners of her mouth looked different too, less poised, more pulled from strain, and in her eyes, not anger, not even bitterness, just a hollow kind of awareness. She had been so certain that leadership meant drawing lines, holding ground, reinforcing values, but somewhere along the way she had begun confusing control with righteousness, regulation with fairness. And the moment she saw Shaquille wear that cross, bold, unapologetic, a truth he wore like skin, she felt it, that rising discomfort, the internal accusation she couldn't name. And instead of confronting it, she had done what people like her always did, deflected, defamed, denied. But now the mirror told the truth, and the truth didn't blink. She saw not just the woman she was today, but the pieces of the girl she used to be. Before the status, before the policies, before she learned to out-talk vulnerability. The girl who once sat in the back pew of a church and cried quietly during communion. The girl who stopped believing in God, not because he failed her, but because people who claimed him had. People who wore crosses while denying jobs, while dismissing pain, while locking doors in the faces of those who didn't look like them. Maybe that's why the sight of Shaq's cross had shaken her so deeply. Because he wasn't just wearing it, he was living it. And that kind of conviction doesn't apologize. It doesn't shrink. It doesn't ask for permission to exist. She looked away from the mirror and sat down on the edge of the tub. Her house, once meticulously pristine, now felt like a shell. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud. Every tick of the wall clock felt like judgment. Not from the outside, from within. Redemption didn't knock. It waited. Meanwhile, across town, Shaq stood outside a small brick church with stained glass windows and a wooden sign that leaned slightly to the right. The building hadn't changed much over the years. The paint was peeling in places, and the roof had been patched 3 times since his father last preached from the pulpit inside. But the spirit of the place was intact. He stepped inside slowly, letting the creak of the door announce his arrival. The sanctuary was empty, save for a single woman sweeping the side aisle. She looked up, recognized him, and smiled gently before slipping out the side door without a word. The scent of old hymnals and candle wax lingered in the air, mixing with the faintest trace of pine cleaner. Shaq walked down the center aisle, not with hesitation, but with reverence. Each step forward was a return, not to a place, but to a promise. He remembered the Sundays spent here, as a boy, his father's voice thundering through the wooden rafters, not in anger, but in conviction. Forgiveness isn't weakness, his father once said. It's the most difficult kind of strength. He hadn't understood that then, not fully, but he did now. At the front of the church, beneath the modest cross mounted on the wall, Shaq knelt. His frame filled the space like a tree leaning toward the ground, not in defeat, but in humility. He bowed his head and closed his eyes. He didn't pray for vengeance. He didn't pray for praise. He prayed for clarity, for strength to keep his peace when others tried to fracture it, for the grace to remain soft in a world that rewarded hardness, and quietly, for her, the woman who had tried so hard to silence him. Not because she deserved it, but because he did. He touched the cross hanging from his neck, feeling its familiar weight, not heavy, but rooted. This was not a symbol of his win. It was a vow, a daily commitment to live the values it stood for. Humility, truth, service, mercy. Forgiveness wasn't forgetting. It wasn't pretending the pain hadn't existed. It was choosing to release it before it corrupted you. Back in her home, the woman poured herself a cup of tea, but let it go cold. She sat by the window, watching the neighborhood she used to orchestrate move without her. Children biked past. A couple walked their dog. Life didn't miss her. It simply moved forward. And for once she didn't resent it. She didn't know what she would do next. Whether she would stay here, whether anyone would want her to. But she did know that power, real power, wasn't in position. It was in presence. And she had spent too long being present in all the wrong ways. She walked to her bookshelf, pulled out an old box of keepsakes, and dug until she found it, a necklace she hadn't worn in years. A small silver cross. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just a token from her childhood, a time when belief still had meaning. She held it in her hand for a long time before placing it gently on the table. She wasn't ready to wear it yet. But maybe, someday. At the church, Shaq rose slowly, his knees aching slightly from the floor. He stood in silence, head tilted toward the cross above. He didn't need applause. He didn't need to be thanked. He just needed to remember who he was, and who he'd promised to be. As he walked out of the church and into the golden light of late afternoon, he passed by a small boy sitting on the steps. The child looked up, wide-eyed, and asked, "Are you a pastor?" Shaq smiled. "No," he said softly. "Just someone who listens." The boy grinned and went back to his drawing. Shaq looked up at the sky, let the light touch his face, and walked on, steady, whole and quietly unshaken. In the mirror, in the church, in the hearts of those watching, the cross still stood. Not as a decoration, but as a decision. The mailboxes in Oak Meadow Glen looked the same as they always had, uniform black with brass handles, spaced evenly along the sidewalk like a row of sentinels. But something had changed, not in their design, but in what was being slipped inside them. One by one, letters began arriving. Not bills, not citations, not glossy HOA newsletters. They were typed on plain white paper. No headers, no logos, just facts, sent anonymously from a third-party debt forgiveness agency. The notices were concise, legal in tone, but life-altering in consequence. The opening line read the same in each envelope. Your outstanding hospital balance has been fully resolved by an anonymous benefactor. 5 families. 5 homes in the neighborhood. 5 stories of quiet suffering that no one really talked about. The Hendersons, whose toddler had battled leukemia for 9 grueling months. The Baldridges, who had maxed out 3 credit cards when their teenage son broke his leg and required multiple surgeries. The Martins, who lived paycheck to paycheck after the father's stroke, barely keeping up with minimum payments. The Rosales family, new to the country, unfamiliar with the system, blindsided by a childbirth bill they hadn't expected. And Elaine Booker, 82 years old, a retired school librarian whose fall in the garden left her with a broken hip and a bank account in ruins. No names were mentioned in the letters. Just confirmation that the debts were gone, wiped clean. At first the families were stunned, then overwhelmed, and finally curious. Who? Why? How? The answers trickled in, not through fanfare, but through breadcrumbs. A comment from a hospital billing rep, a mention of a private fund set up months earlier, a silent donation that crossed no headlines. Eventually the truth bloomed from the quiet soil of speculation. Shaq. It wasn't just a theory. It was confirmed quietly by the hospital's internal billing coordinator, an older woman who'd once seen Shaq carry groceries for a neighbor in the parking lot. She never forgot the way he smiled, said thank you even when she hadn't done anything for him. When she saw his name attached to the payment transfers, she wasn't surprised, just moved. Back in the neighborhood, the revelation didn't come with trumpets. It came with tears. Lois Templeton, the elderly woman who once recounted how Shaq saved her husband, found herself sitting at her kitchen table, gripping the debt forgiveness letter with shaking hands. She wept, not for the money, but for the way she had once avoided Shaq at the mailbox. Unsure of how to relate to someone she didn't understand. Arturo Morales, the hard-working father who shared his story at the HOA meeting, stood in his driveway for a full hour, staring at the sky, unable to explain to his kids why he felt both humbled and ashamed. The former board members who had stayed quiet during the campaign of citations felt their stomachs turn. They hadn't just missed what was right, they had enabled what was wrong. And then came the second revelation. It was Miles Carrington who brought it to light, standing at the old church on the east side of town, Mount Grace Fellowship, its doors newly refinished, its interior smelling of fresh paint and hope. Years ago the church had suffered a fire, faulty wiring. The damage was extensive. Insurance covered some, but not all. The congregation, mostly working-class families and elders, began holding services in the basement and praying for a miracle. It came. Quietly. Shaq had written the check under a pseudonym. No one knew at the time, not even the pastor. But Miles, in his work with community grants, came across the record while reviewing a separate project. The numbers didn't lie. The name on the filing, the account it was linked to, it all traced back. Shaq hadn't just helped build the church back. He had paid for every pew, every fixture, every bag of cement. He asked for nothing in return, didn't even attend the reopening. Miles stood at the altar and took it all in, sunlight pouring through stained glass. The smell of cedar still fresh. He thought of every conversation, every moment Shaq had stood silently in the background of community events, letting others talk, letting others shine. He had never needed to be the center. He had just made sure everyone else could find their place. Back in Oak Meadow Glen, the stories continued to ripple. A woman who once criticized Shaq's lack of HOA participation found out he had anonymously paid for her daughter's school lunch account for a full semester after overhearing her at the corner store. A teenager confessed Shaq had bought him his first graphing calculator after he'd almost dropped out of advanced math. No spotlight, no ceremony, just consistent, intentional acts of faith in motion. What they never knew about Big Shaq wasn't just his past as an athlete or his wealth. It was the quiet choices he made when no one was looking. The way he used his strength not to dominate, but to lift. The way he forgave without being asked. The way he served without ever asking to be seen. He had walked among them like an anchor, not flashy, not loud, but steady. He had worn his cross not as a decoration, but as a discipline, a daily practice of compassion. One evening, a small chalk drawing appeared on the sidewalk outside his home. It was of a heart. Inside it, a cross. Beside it, 2 words. Thank you. He never found out who drew it. He didn't try to, but he paused beside it for a long time, one hand resting in his pocket, the other gently touching the chain around his neck. At the next neighborhood gathering, Shaq attended like he always did, quietly, respectfully, slightly apart. But this time, the space didn't feel distant. It felt people approached him, not all at once, not in a swarm, but one by one. A handshake, a pat on the back, a child's drawing handed over without words, a pie wrapped in foil, a folded card. No one said everything they wanted to say, because how do you thank someone for showing you who you could be? Shaq smiled, nodded, said little. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was just trying to live in a way that mattered. The man they had once judged in whispers, he had already spoken the loudest. He had already left a legacy not in speeches or posts, but in people, in debts cleared, in churches rebuilt, in kindness multiplied, and in a neighborhood that finally understood. Big Shaq had been the heartbeat of Oak Meadow Glen all along. Not every act of courage needs a spotlight. Sometimes, the boldest stand is the one you take with your silence, your kindness, your consistency. Look around, your neighborhood has a shack. Maybe you are the shack. The question is, when the world tests your grace, will you still wear your cross?